one of the things that I think is the most underrated part of bushcraft and survival, self-reliance, whatever you want to call it, whether it's short-term or long-term, is a good night's sleep. And Morse Kahansky says that every person needs 2 hours of REM-type sleep per night. Well, that's a lot of scientific stuff that, you know, I don't know a whole lot about. But what I will tell you is, if I wake up 2, 3, 4 times in the middle of the night, I don't get a good night's sleep, and I'm a crabby camper in the morning. And it only takes so many days like that before your judgment's going to get clouded, before you're going to start making mistakes, before you're going to get irritated and irritable with your campmates and things like that if you have them. So a good night's sleep is something that you need to learn how to do or how to get. And it's a really good sign of how decent a woodsman is. If you go out into the woods with someone, or you travel with someone, or you go camping with someone, and the next morning they're complaining that they didn't get any sleep, they don't have much experience in the woods. The ability to get a good night's sleep in a wilderness situation is one of the true marks of how good a person's skills are in the woods. So I'm going to leave you with that thought. We'll continue with this series. And again, you know, if this were summertime, I could just raise this tarp up on all 4 sides, fly it over the top of this thing, and I'd still be off the ground. One thing that's worth noting as far as getting off the ground is, a lot of people worry about, I need to get off the ground, I need to get off the ground, I need to get off the ground. In some cases that's true. In the case of a damp ground or a wet ground, it's better if you can get yourself elevated. But if you're just trying to get away from the critters, bugs can crawl, snakes can climb. It's not going to keep them out of your bed necessarily. It might make you feel a little more psychologically comfortable, but it may not necessarily keep them out of your bed. Morning guys, Dave Canterbury at the Pathfinder School. Out here where we have our temporary shelter set up out on the trap line. And we've got a ridge pole set up here that I put up the other day. I want to start improving this shelter like we talked about in the first few videos, get this thing ready for winter stays. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of build a little bit of a half-face shelter. Now what's important to understand with a shelter like this, from my perspective, is that if I only plan to stay here for a night here and there, I'm not planning on inhabiting this thing long term. I want to keep it as small and constricted as possible because it will hold the heat in better that way. I can always throw this tarp over an unfinished product and work on it as I go. It's not imperative that I finish it today or that you finish it in one day necessarily either. It's a constant improvement. As long as I've got this 8x8 trail tarp, I can always throw it over the unfinished portion. But I'd like to get this thing closed in on 3 sides fairly well before, you know, the really cold weather starts to hit, and get a good fire pit dug out here and things like that. Now, another thing that we need to talk about during this video is how we're going to build this shelter. We could build this shelter very easily by sparsely putting uprights across the back side of this ridge pole here, and then we could web that in with vines and things like that and then fill that over with debris. Or if we've got plenty of resources, we can try to fill that thing completely in as best we can with just upright saplings, and then we're not going to have near as much gaps that we have to try to fill with leaves. All we're doing at that point is adding insulation. So stay with me, we'll see what we can do, and we'll get started. Okay, so where we're at is we've put one support Y here, and we've got these sticks about, I don't know, 8 inches apart. We're going to go all the way across. We're going to put another Y on the other side of this bed. Then we'll start coming around in a cone shape around this bed. And I've got a basic survival class coming out here this weekend. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the initial framework done. And then I'm going to film the basic survival class finishing this shelter, getting their education in primitive shelter building for an emergency. And I'll film that and add it to this video so you guys can see that and see some of the instructional that goes along with that. And then you'll be able to see the complete building of this shelter a lot better than me stopping and starting the camera and things like that. Okay, here's one thing I want to show you real fast. You know, I'm never going to use an axe if I can use a saw. But axes come in handy for a lot of things. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to wedge this pole up on here and down to that tree crotch. And this axe allows me to pound that backwards, really get that wedged in there so that when I put a pole on there, it's going to be solid. And that's the key, is to get this thing as solid as you can without a bunch of lashings and bindings, because you don't want to have to use a bunch of lashings and bindings if you don't have to. Okay, so What we're looking for on this side of the bed is exactly what we've got. We've got a small crown coming out just in a semicircle around to the front edge of the bed here and around the back side back here. And these logs, these upright logs, are against the bed and they're against the top pole. You want to close that gap. You want to hold in as much heat right there as you can. And this is a winter type survival shelter. This is not a messing around type shelter. This is something I'm going to stay in if it's really good and cold and I want to make sure I got a comfortable night's sleep. This is it. This takes a lot of work. Okay, I've been out here for at least an hour and a half, maybe longer than that, cutting this stuff. And like I said, I'm not going to use an axe for anything that I can use a saw for. But you know what? Pushing a bow saw is no picnic either when you got to cut 40, 50 poles. We've cut probably, I'm going to guess, 20 poles here, which equates to about 11 sapling trees or 11 pieces of deadfall that we could find. But you still got to cut the stuff down. Now on the top, I want this stuff sticking above the ridge, and we'll talk about that later. When I get my basic students out here working on this shelter this weekend, we'll fill in a lot of the gaps that you're not seeing right now.